Welcome to this week's episode of Deer Dirt. I'm going to be walking around the farm today, just checking things out, getting the status update, see where I'm at, and I'll show you a few of the things I've been doing here and what's working and what's not. But the main theme, and I've got some help here as you can see behind me, one of the dogs has joined me, but the main theme of today's episode is to really focus in on how to recognize and rank the needs that you have on your farm, and then which ones to work on first. So it's really about prioritizing your effort. And I'm going to focus in on three different categories: the food, the habitat, and the herd. You can see behind me I'm standing next to my corn food plot. I've got two of them on the farm. This one's doing really well. The other one's up on a ridge where it was super dry and it's not doing that great, but you can see there's going to be a lot of food here. This is going to be one of my focal points when the season starts. So let's talk about food. Let's talk about how do you know if you don't have enough? And to me, this is a two-part process. You know, it's not just the food, it's also the deer numbers. Because you can say, well, I don't have hardly any food here, but if you don't have hardly any deer, you know, it doesn't really matter, you're still in check. So what you're trying to do is balance the food to the herd density. You can determine if you have enough food for the number of deer that you've got by looking at two things. If you're planting food, you know, are they eating it all before the end of the winter? You know, if they wipe out all of the food sometime during the winter before the spring green up, then you don't have enough food for the number of deer that you've got. They're running out of nutrition. The other thing you can look at is the amount of damage that they're doing to the habitat, the browse. You know, how much are they, you know, what kind of a browse line do you have? And I'm looking around here and there isn't one on this farm, but I've been places where it's really, really bad, where you can just see, you know, about 4 feet up, it just looks like somebody went through, you know, with a saw and cut off every limb, every twig, every leaf from that height down. That's just what the deer can reach. So they're just eating everything. So I'm happy with that. I don't have too many deer, or I have enough food for the deer that I have, which is, like I said, they're kind of interconnected. I've said it before, but I think you need somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5% of your total acres to be in dedicated food for the deer. And that's so variable depending upon the situation that you're in. But let's say you've got that and you've committed that and the deer are still wiping you out. You either have to take down the number of deer, or you have to ramp up the amount of food, or both. I suppose it makes sense now to talk about deer density and herd dynamics. If I'm trying to figure out, like if I'm on a consulting trip visiting somebody's property and I'm trying to figure out if they have too many deer, you know, what their herd looks like, one of the questions I ask right away is, you know, if you're sitting on a food plot in the evening, not during the rut, but let's say early or late season, what percentage of the deer that come out are bucks and what percentage are does? Ideally, it would be 3 does to every buck or better. By better, I mean less does, more bucks. Ideally, you'd have close to a 1-to-1 ratio between bucks and does. And it can be hard to do that if you don't have, you know, a fair amount of property, because, you know, your neighbors might be shooting a lot of bucks and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, because if you shoot enough does to bring that ratio down, there might not be very many of them left in the area because, you know, the supply of bucks is so low. But let's just assume that you have a little bit more control. You know, whether you've created a co-op where you and your neighbors are working together, or whether you control enough acres that you can make a difference, then I would strive for 1-to-1, with 1 buck to 3 does being the acceptable upper limit of does to bucks. If you're at that point, then I would say you're working toward a maintenance level of harvest. You know, you may not be trying to bring your herd numbers down or, again, depending upon the amount of food you may be. But a 3 to 1 or better, then I think you feel like you're in the ballpark with having the right kind of herd dynamics. I guess before I get too far along, maybe we should go to a new location. I want to show you some other stuff on the farm. Okay, next I want to show you something that I think is pretty cool. Other people might not think it's so cool, but it's near and dear to my heart. I like creating oak hardwood forests. In my part of the Midwest, and probably in most of the Midwest in general, the amount of oak is starting to decline. You get a lot of junk timber. And I've been to enough places and I've looked at enough farms in the process of buying this one and some of my consulting that I've done. There aren't a lot of really nice oak timbers out there. So anytime I'm trying to create habitat in an area that was maybe marginal acres in the past, like this behind me, this was a steep slope, too steep to put a food plot into on this pasture. Well, this was a pasture farm when I bought it, so I'll call it a pasture farm. So this was just grass, cool season grasses. So my first step was to kill it and then till it up, spread acorns, and then disc them in lightly and bury them. And that was back in November. So now we're 9 months out from that. And I'm going to show you now what kind of success we've had. It's a pretty cool practice, pretty labor intensive, but yeah, I recommend it now to anybody that is looking for creating habitat. I like planting acorns better than planting the trees themselves, because I feel like you can put out so many acorns that you can swamp the deer and they just don't get ahead of it and wipe them out like they would if you go through planting seedlings with a row planter. So anyway, getting back to our conversation, we feel like the herd is out of whack for sure if you're sitting on more than 3 does per buck. You need to fix that. That would be a priority. That wouldn't be necessarily, well, I'm not really going to prioritize these things as much as I'm going to say they all need to be done, because year one you need to get to work on it. You can't wait. As soon as you recognize you got a problem, it's time to fix it. There's no upside in waiting. The biologists that I've talked to say that in a normal, fairly high quality range, you have to kill 25% of your adult deer every year to keep the herd from growing. That's a kind of a rule of thumb. And again, if you're trying to reduce the number of deer, then you're going to have to kill more than 25%. And if you feel like you're on the low end, which is, I won't say it's rare, but in a lot of parts of the country, it's rare to be on the low end. You'd want to shoot less than 25% of your adult deer. That would be a one priority in my book. Everything is probably a one priority if you want the truth, but habitat is so ongoing. I mean, you can spend your whole life fixing the habitat. It doesn't mean you shouldn't start on it right away, but I think in general, the habitat probably falls, as a 3 priority compared to, or a 2 priority compared to food and getting the herd dynamics right. So now let's look at a new location and I'll talk a little bit more about habitat. If you remember 2 weeks ago, I was talking about water and I showed you a pond. There it is, 2 weeks later, and it's almost dry. Just a little slick of water out in the middle. So that makes me think that I've got to keep an eye on, I mean, ideally I'd have water here. Maybe I'd have to create some. That can be a weakness of a property. I do have flowing water here, so that's good, but it's not enough to be useful to the deer over the whole property. So as the season comes in, one of my main things to watch for is going to be, where are the deer finding water, because that's going to be a place where I can hunt them. Okay, so I'm going to talk about habitat on the farm now. Habitat for me wasn't a number 2 or a number 3 priority. It was a number 1, but my situation is probably just a little bit different than most people. This farm didn't have a lot of deer on it when I bought it. It was a pasture farm, like I said, and deer and cows aren't real compatible. You know, they'll live together on some level, but you know, the cows, they eat a lot of the same browse that the deer would like, and they don't really like being in close proximity, you know, the deer don't, to the cows. So with the deer density low here, I felt like I had an opportunity to do a bunch of habitat work first. You know, I don't want a bunch of deer here eating everything that I try to grow. I mean, eventually, once everything gets into place and the wheels are kind of turning and the gears are, you know, aligned, then it might make sense to have more deer here. But right away, right off the bat, I want to be able to grow the stuff that I feel like long-term is going to make this farm awesome. And one of the things that I did this year was planting browse shrubs. I planted red osier dogwood, some like chokecherry, wild plum. Of course, the oaks that I showed you from Acorn, those aren't necessarily for browse, but you know, if you had a lot of deer, they'd nip those things off right away. So being able to prioritize habitat over deer density, I think is important, because even once I get in here and start doing the timber stand improvement, you know, back in the woods itself, I'm going to create a lot of browse. And this place is going to completely transform. You'll be able to feed a lot more deer if there's a lot of browse. So let's talk about that real quick and then we'll move on. But let's say that you've got a limited amount of food in the food plots or the ag fields. Ideally, the deer would enter those places with their stomachs half full. You know, if they come out into your you know, clover plot or your soybean patch or whatever it might be with their stomach half full of browse, they're not going to eat as much as they would if they show up with their stomach 25% full. So the more browse there is, the further your food plots will go and the less you have to spend, and basically the more, you know, the healthier your deer are going to be. I talked last week about the importance of having thick cover, you know, just from the, you know, the standpoint of the bucks tolerating each other at a higher density, but it goes beyond that. It also includes just, you know, having a healthier herd, better fed. So, you know, I didn't see the habitat work as falling down the list. That was number one for me. I didn't even care what deer were on here. I mean, you know, obviously I wanted deer, but that wasn't my biggest concern. My biggest concern was getting the habitat into shape so that when the deer really, when I start pumping the food to it, you know, and start, you know, making the place more attractive, that what I'm hoping to be here will grow. And so far so good. I mean, the browse that I planted is doing well. You know, we're several months into that and the deer haven't really devoured that yet. So habitat is important. You know, again, if you look through your timber and it's open and there's not much growing, you know, from say 4 feet and down, you need to do a lot of work. You need to create more ground cover. The ground cover is going to turn into browse in some cases. Ideally, you'd burn just often enough to keep that fresh. The biologists that I've talked to feel that burning once every 3 years is about right for a whitetail timber, and that keeps it in that early succession. So there's plenty of browse, plenty of, you know, very attractive, very palatable food available. And that's one of the things that I need to do a better job of here. I haven't burned yet, and it intimidates me a little bit. You know, I don't love the idea of lighting this place on fire without really knowing what I'm doing. So I need to bring some experts in, and I need to come up with a, you know, a really good plan and bite it off in small pieces rather than getting on the upwind end and starting it on fire and hoping it goes out before it gets to the neighbor. I need to have a good plan. So that is my assessment of habitat. I put it number one. I put herd density number two and food number two. In my mind, they're both about the same priority. But I can make the place a lot better long term by having awesome habitat. And it's hard to do that if you've got a lot of deer. So I'll take you to one more spot and then we'll wrap up from there. This farm is really unique from the standpoint of apple trees. There are hundreds of wild apple trees on this farm. I don't know how they got started or, you know, how they got spread. Cows may have spread them, you know, eating the apples and then passing them through. But man, oh man, I've never been any place that had more wild apple trees. So that's really good. In fact, that makes my job a little bit easier because pretty much every year they're going to bear a lot of apples. But then you're looking at the other kind of mast, and that's the hard mast. And then you're thinking acorns. Well, not every year is a good acorn year. It just so happens that this year is. So I've done a fair amount of scouting over the past couple of weeks, and some of our species of oak are carrying really well. The black oaks are doing really well. Whites, less, but maybe a quarter of the trees have got apples or acorns on them. And then the red oak, they look pretty good, but they're not as good as the blacks. The blacks are just loaded. But since I've got you looking at this apple tree, that is what a browse line looks like. See how they've eaten everything from 4 feet and down. There's nothing that's still on the tree that they can reach. You don't want that. I mean, obviously on apple trees it's not a big deal, but on everything else that's growing along the edge of the woods, you don't want to see a browse line. So let's wrap up from here. Hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. It's been fun just kind of roaming around the farm and showing you different stuff. And maybe I'll do that again next week because I got a few more things to show you. Food, do you have enough? Deer, do you have the right ratio and the right number for the property that you own? And then the habitat, is it good enough? And find the stuff that needs to be fixed and get to work on it. Like I said, my priorities might be a little bit different than others. Some people would prioritize food. I prioritize habitat. Well, I appreciate you joining me. I'll see you right back here again in a couple more weeks for the next episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt.